Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building a Network of 195 Drupal 8 Sites, bringing Drupal 8 to Fairfax County Public Schools. Your speakers for today are Ben Stoffel-Rosales, Partner Manager here at Pantheon, along with Kurt Belker, VP of Solutions at Forum 1, and Aaron Zink, Technology Manager, also at Forum 1. Just a few housekeeping items to go over before we start. Please make sure you submit any questions you have during the presentation in the question window, or tweet them at GetPantheon. We'll answer as many of the questions as we can during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to everyone next week. I'd now like to turn it over to Ben, Kurt, and Aaron.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Stoffel-Rosales, and as a partner manager at Pantheon, my role is to work with awesome agencies like Forum 1. I help their sales team win enterprise business and help the technical teams use our development platform really efficiently.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kurt Belker. I'm the Vice President of Solutions at Forum 1. I work with our clients who are mostly federal agencies, nonprofit organizations, and foundations, do amazing things with digital technology to help make a bigger impact on their missions.
And I'm Aaron Zink, and I'm a tech manager here at Forum 1. I served as the tech lead on the Fairfax County Public School site build, and we'll be able to talk to some of the tech issues today.
So we've got a full slate of about 30 to 40 minutes of this case study for you today. We're going to talk about Fairfax County Public Schools a little bit as introduce you to what they were trying to achieve, some about them and their background, some of the pains that they're experiencing and why they turned to Drupal. And then we're going to move quickly and dive into some of the technical challenges that we encountered and how we addressed them, some specifics about the architecture that we use to meet their specific needs, and hopefully have an engaging conversation with you all at the end about your questions. So by way of background, Fairfax County Public Schools is the 10th largest school district in the United States of America. It's in Virginia. For those of you who don't know, it's just outside of Washington, D.C. It's a suburb. And they have nearly 200,000 students that attend 194 schools throughout the county. It's actually the biggest employer in Virginia, about 24,000 employees. For almost a decade, they had been managing their web infrastructure with HTML and Dreamweaver. And they were obviously, as you can imagine, starting to hit some growing pains because of the, not just the technology that they were using, but how they were able to manage those digital operations. The quality and consistency of the sites in that ecosystem, and the processes and tools that they needed to use to manage their communications. Within those 194 schools, every single school has its own dedicated web presence, and they're a combination of elementary schools, as you can imagine, middle schools, high schools, some continuing education facilities as well. And they also have the central fcps.edu website, which represents their administration and the school system itself. This is a screenshot of where they were before we started working with them. And they had a number of challenges, as you can imagine. Just kind of as a representation of where they were with their web presences, the most accessed page in 2015 for Fairfax County Public Schools across their ecosystem of close to 200 websites was the 404 error page. So they were struggling with consistency, as you can imagine, with kind of hand building these individual websites. And that's just representative. Obviously, the sites at the time were not mobile ready, which is a big challenge, particularly for the modern age that we live in and the constituents that they were trying to serve, parents and teachers, citizens of the county, administrators. Another big challenge that they were facing was that the county has technology specialists in each school whose real job is to educate kids, to help them introduce technology into the classroom and do real instruction. And over time, a lot of these technology specialists within the schools had basically become the de facto web managers, managing these individual school sites. So there's a real need for the school to decrease the time that these specialists needed to even manage a website and increase the number of content authors at the school system and be able to still control that really carefully from a centralized perspective. We'll talk about that some. Yeah, so as a result, those folks were spending way too much time HTMLing their way around their Dreamweaver templates and not enough time teaching. But really the most important improvement that Fairfax County needed to make, as you can imagine, across all of these individual school sites, they all share really, really similar needs, from curriculum, course management, content management, calendaring, teacher directories and profiles, and different types of schools had different needs as well. High schools obviously have more needs for clubs and more complex curriculum management. Elementary schools, not as much. So they also were in the process of going through a big rebrand. So Fairfax County Public Schools had invested in a organizational overhaul of their public presence. And so they needed to enforce this new brand across all these sites and at the same time accommodate for all of those features to be centrally managed and rolled out to those school sites, those features being the directories and the alerting and such. And they really didn't have a way to do that centrally short of just an HTML template that was shared. So that was our challenge, was to jump in and to provide that. Yeah, so just a little bit, and Aaron's going to get into this in a lot more detail, but from a ecosystem of sites perspective, fcps.edu, the central site, shares some relationships with each of the individual school sites. Each individual school site needs to maintain its own tone and its own school spirit, and needs to reflect that. But at the same time, it needs to share some content from the main site, like calendars, events and blogs. Alerts, weather alerts, system-wide alerts are all managed centrally and then distributed to the individual school sites. And the schools themselves have to obviously be able to handle their own alerts as well. So there's this relationship between the sites, but each site also needs to be able to pursue its own uniqueness. And so that was really the big challenge that we're going to talk about and how we addressed it. It turns out that this scenario really is a great fit for Drupal. And we were able to leverage install profiles, which is Drupal's way of handling, let's call it a site in a box, right? So for these school sites, Forum 1 developed and created the starter site for any school. It shares certain features. It shares pre-configured security enhancements. It shares some integrations with some authentication systems and user systems. And it gave Fairfax County the ability to centralize, to manage all of that from basically one code base, so we can push changes out across the ecosystem of sites. It also gives them it really helped them address that burden of managing so many properties and expanding who is able to manage them using Drupal's content authoring flexibility. So I'm going to hand it now to Ben, who's going to talk a little bit about under the hood with Pantheon and how Pantheon platform helps manage this install profile approach to managing the ecosystem of websites.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. So Forum 1 came to Pantheon during the proposal and RFP process and positioned us as their technology partner for Fairfax County Public Schools. And arriving at Drupal 8 as a CMS was only one piece of the puzzle for Fairfax County. They also had to decide between a number of hosting providers and technical implementations that would suit the needs of the school district. Ultimately, they decided, along with Forum 1, on building the sites on Pantheon because of our custom upstreams feature and code distribution model. So Fairfax County had requirements for the flexibility for schools to reflect their own unique spirit and focus. So for example, schools can build in differentiation at the theme layer with unique school brand colors, as well as disseminate school-specific communications for their programs. Furthermore, they needed a way to centrally manage the development and deployment of code for the entire network of sites. They needed to be able to push updates really quickly and efficiently across their sites while still factoring in per site custom code. And for these reasons, Forum 1 and Fairfax County felt that scaling one Drupal install in a Drupal multi-site to 195 sites would be a straitjacket fit. It would have hampered the possibility for Snowflake sites and individual site resources, as well as made central management of this code at scale a huge headache. Pantheon's custom upstream model works as such. So organizations can create and update sites from a common code base using what we call a custom upstream. So there's multiple layers of repositories in play here. The updates flow downstream from one level to another. So at the very top would be Pantheon's core upstream, in this case D8, and core updates are made available by Pantheon to all sites on the platform for your given core CMS. And then downstream is the custom upstream that Forum 1 has built for Fairfax Public County Schools. This code repository contains code for all of their sites. So this would be like a parent theme and common plugins and contrib modules. This is basically a pre-baked install profile with business logic and configuration and security and I think even a bit of content. So the custom upstream repository is actually hosted on GitHub and connected to Pantheon. So when Forum 1 is spinning up new sites, their team can select this custom upstream as a scaffold for new sites, which makes creating a new site based on that repository a breeze. And then finally, downstream from custom upstreams is an individual site repository. So these individual repos inherit updates from that custom upstream, but then also contain site-specific code like a child theme or site-specific plugins and custom code for that one site. When a Drupal or WordPress core update is released, Pantheon, again, makes that update available to all sites that run that particular CMS. And similarly, when Forum 1 updates their custom upstream, these changes are made available to each site that relies on that custom upstream in Pantheon. So this is your organizational dashboard. You can also use our tagging feature on the left to filter sites into related categories. And Aaron will get into more detail as to how their team uses this feature. But for example, you can see here they're tagging sites as unlaunched as an easy way to see which schools still need to deploy code, and they can prioritize the propagation of code across sites that are actually live. And not only does this workflow free up developer time, it establishes a sustainable and scalable process for handling updates across massive site portfolios. So new features and functionality can be continuously developed in the custom upstream repository and then distributed to each site where they can be, where those updates can be applied with a couple clicks by site owners. And Forum 1 has built some really cool automation and orchestration tooling so they can quickly propagate changes across their entire site network efficiently. And I'll pass it over to Aaron Zink at Forum 1 to talk more about how his team does that.
Great, thanks, Ben. So as we've been discussing a bit, I want to give you a little bit more kind of context for the, what we built and the needs that we had going into this. We've got the main fcps.edu central site that is representing the entire school system, and then we got the individual school sites. And we draw a distinction between the two of those. We built the central school site on its own code base, and then all the school sites share this common install profile code base that we've been talking about so far. But then there's some data and some content that needs to be shared amongst those. So one example of that would be events. Here you can see, for example, the West Potomac High School events listing page. And if we had this as a live website, we could scroll down a little bit and see that there's a mix of events here that come from the central site, as well as ones that have been populated by actual content editors on the West Potomac site specifically. So we get a real mix of things there. They get those central site events automatically brought in, but then have the flexibility to put their own events on the calendar. Some other examples would be, here we've got news and features. So these are news and essentially blog posts. And some of these are hosted on the school site. We're looking at the Cedar Lane site here. Some of these are specific to this school, and then others have come in automatically from the central site. And the way we're handling, in this case, some of this central site content to make it easier to maintain is when we bring it into these school sites, it's only brought in as a stub, as a title and like a teaser, just a little bit of information so that it can be featured in these sorts of listing pages and landing pages. If you were to click on the title of one of those that belongs to the central site, you'd actually be redirected off to the central site itself. And that makes the content management a little bit easier. You don't have 200 copies of the same content that individuals are editing and managing. Next. Another really important thing that's shared across these sites is alerts, and these are primarily used to indicate when there are weather issues and causing school closings. And in this case, the alerts need to go out across all their sites. We want it to display prominently at the top of every page on any site so that visitors just can't miss the fact that there's an alert. It needs to go out, pretty immediately. And we don't want to have 200 schools all individually dealing with posting that, and much less worrying about posting it to every single page. So building a way to have this stuff shared was really key. And what we did here actually is the alerts are all hosted on the central site. They can, when they're created, the editor can target them to the entire network or to some subset of sites in the event that maybe an alert only applies to a subset of sites. And then the individual school sites have actually JavaScript that consumes a central feed of alerts to pull down the alerts that are relevant to the school and display those at the top of the page. And this really has eased the burden on them for deploying alerts. Next. Here's an example of how we do allow some differentiation. Our designers put together or selected some colors that worked well with our theme, and the individual school editors can choose from these colors, and these are coordinated with school colors themselves, obviously, but they can choose from these colors to pick what are going to be the primary and secondary colors on their site. There's some other differentiation we allow, and you can go to the next slide here, and we can see this is an example of three different sites, three different school sites that are differentiated via color, logo, and then through the use of real prominent imagery and them making different image choices, they can also really capture a different feel to the site. So let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into the school install profile. For those who aren't familiar, in Drupal, install profiles are essentially a special type of module. And most of the things you can do with a module, you can do in an install profile. But the install profile, when it's chosen during the site install process, is responsible for setting up whatever configuration and business logic that it desires. And so we've got one here that when you run through that install process, at the end, you end up with sort of a vanilla version of a school site with the appropriate theme, a little bit of default content, such as a custom 404 page, a home page with the basic regions laid out in it, and so on, created. In addition, it brings along all of the relevant code for importing users from the central site, importing content from the central site, all of our secure configuration settings, and all that stuff is just gotten out of the box when we run our install profile. So let's look at the next slide, and I can kind of walk you through a little bit of what that looks like when we do it on the Pantheon side. Next slide.
It should be.
I wonder if my screen froze. There we go. Great. So on the Pantheon platform, you can just via the UI create new sites, and during the site creation process, you can choose from these upstreams, and as Ben already spoke, we've got a custom upstream which essentially contains our code base that has the install profile, and just by clicking deploy there, you end up with a new site. It provisions it, you get to see this screen. Next. And eventually you end up here with a familiar Drupal install interface, and we've got our install profile selected down there, and when we go click next, we end up installing the site, and then we've got this form where users can customize the site for the individual school. So out of the box, this is kind of the basic level of site-wide customization that we're allowing currently. And you can see that we've got social share links that are embedded on every page based upon those, the logo, the colors, and so on. It would be possible for us to do more variation. At this point, this is all we've needed to do. One of the nice things about using the upstream approach is that if we need to, we're not locked in, and we can go in and really completely customize the code base for an individual school while still retaining some relationship to that parent upstream code base. So it's really nice to know that we're not totally locked into all sites having to share the same code base. Next. So once a site is created, we can continue to push code updates to it. And we like to use Terminus for this. And Terminus is a Pantheon-specific tool that gives you a shell environment for scripting commands against their platform. So in the previous slides, we saw some of the interface for clicking and doing things in the platform. Everything that you can click and do via their UI, you can do with Terminus, which is a lot more flexible. So, we showed an example there of creating a site via the UI. We've actually not done that much at all. We've got scripts that create our sites, and not only create the sites, but go further and set a bunch of other settings in the Pantheon environment, like enabling Redis, enabling New Relic, locking the sites down so that newly spawned sites can't be accessed by the general public, and so on. So all that stuff we can just bake into a script to have really much more reliable site and reliable and consistent and efficient site creation. We also use it, as I mentioned, for deploying new code. So rather than having to go into that interface that Ben showed, where we've got, hey, 16 new updates for this site, and having to click individually on 130 sites or 195 sites, we can run a script that cycles through all of our sites, uses Terminus to go ahead and pull those code updates down and run any other Drupal-specific commands like configuration import and so on to make sure that our code is deployed in a reliable fashion.
Aaron, it might be worth noting here quickly that we're deploying the sites in bundles. So typically, between 15 to 25 sites would be stood up at a time, and then those individual schools are taken through the process of customizing and loading their own content and readying the site for actual live launch.
That's right. And right now, you may recall seeing a previous slide here that we've got about 135 sites in existence right now on the Pantheon platform. That number has been going up maybe 10 a week or so, depending, as more sites are getting online, ready to start using the new platform. The other key thing that we're able to do here with Terminus is use their tagging feature that Ben mentioned to track which schools are launched, which schools are unlaunched. That's probably been the most valuable thing for us, but we've also in the past used it to track if certain schools have certain features enabled. We didn't roll out Redis to all sites at the same time, so we were able to track which sites had Redis enabled. And that's been really useful in targeting commands to subsets of sites. So that's a real valuable thing we're getting for free with the platform. I should also mention, actually, we use it for running backups. Before we you get automated backups from Pantheon, but before we do any code deployment, we're able to kick off a backup with Terminus and just ensure we've got a fresh backup before any code deployment. So here, another thing to speak about here is configuration management and features. And for folks who are familiar and conversant in the Drupal ecosystem, you'll probably know the word features. It is a common approach in Drupal 7 and even Drupal 6 for taking configuration that would typically only live in the Drupal database and exporting it to the code base. And there are many advantages to getting your configuration into code. Makes site deployment easier rather than having to click through a staging site and test things and then click through and make the same configuration on a live site. Having to remember all that and take notes, that's really obviously error prone and cumbersome. It also just makes it easier to track changes using revisioning in your Git or other code versioning system. So it's been an important part of the Drupal ecosystem. It also obviously lets you reuse features if you've got them in code. If you've got configuration in code, you can apply that to a new site. So we wanted to get those same benefits in Drupal 8. There's a great new thing that's been built into Drupal 8 called configuration management that essentially makes features obsolete for many use cases, not necessarily all, but for many use cases. It's now possible in Drupal 8 with a single click to export your complete site configuration to code, and that is built into Drupal 8 core. You can also then re-import your complete site configuration from a exported, code base back into the database. But we had to weigh, do we want to use configuration management? Do we want to use features? Because they don't play nicely together, and I can get into that more if people have questions about it, but you really need to pick one or the other. If you're going to use configuration management and commit that stuff to your code base, you really shouldn't be using features, and vice versa. They don't play nicely. What we've learned really is that configuration management is a great solution if you've got essentially a single site and you want to track all the configuration for that site in code, really every single piece of configuration. There are some tools to make it so that you can track subsets to some degree, but it really is oriented around every single piece of configuration. Features is better for subsets of configuration and really has gone back to its roots as a way to take some subset of configuration and then apply that subset to other sites. In our case, we ended up kind of doing things a little bit backwards. We ended up using configuration management for our school install profile, which has proven to be a little bit painful because obviously, as we said, our school sites do need some differentiation. So our common code base that has our fully exported configuration in it, we don't necessarily want exactly that same configuration to apply to all of our schools. We want most of it, but not all of it. So we've managed to get around some of these things with a module called config filter that lets us, when we generate our configuration, filter out certain aspects of the configuration that we expect to be able to deviate across sites. But there still is a little bit of pain there, and if we had to do it over again, we would want to use features as a better fit for that use case. And if folks do have questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. Next. We ran into a few things. Drupal 8, when we were working on this site, was fairly young still, and as it's a significant rewrite compared to Drupal 7, there's been plenty of growing pains and things to learn. Some things that I thought would be useful to share with folks. We ran into some issues with multilingual combined with workflow. So the original goal for the central site was to have all content be available in up to 8 different languages, and to have all of our content on the central site pass through a sort of an approval workflow, a draft, needs approval, published, and so on, states. Well, the long and short of it, after a lot of pain and suffering, has been that there are serious bugs in Drupal 8 around multilingual with workflow, and it's frankly just not possible right now to do. So if that's a use case that you care about, be aware of that. We can get you links to some of the main issues on Drupal.org discussing this, and it is being actively worked on. but it's really not possible right now. So in the case of SCPS, we ended up deciding that the workflow stuff was more important than the multilingual. We stripped out all the multilingual. We are now using Google Translate to do just automated machine translation in the display layer from Google, and we have pressed on with using, in our case, workbench moderation because we built the site before content moderation was in core. Another key pain point for us has been with Drupal 8's caching layer. Now, Drupal 8's done some pretty neat new things with caching. It has made cache expiration a lot more granular, is caching things at many more levels than it used to. So there's a lot of new power here. But one thing that it is doing that is a problem is if you're using the standard database backend to handle your caching, it will currently grow without bound. That is never properly cleaned up, and so we found with the amount of traffic that the central site was getting that within mere hours the database, the cache tables in the database were tens of gigabytes in size, as all these various permutations of cacheable items were being entered into the table. This is obviously a problem. If you are needing to use the database cache backend, you should use a module called Slushy Cache, S-L-U-S-H-I. So we switched to using that, and that allowed Drupal to at least clean that table up and prevent it from becoming egregiously large. We have since switched to using Redis, which is nice because it's what's called an LRU cache, but in other words, given a fixed cache size, old things just will fall off as the cache grows. So we don't have the problem of things growing without bounds, but there are still some issues around caching in Drupal 8. One thing that's going to be nice is they're going to separate out what's called render caching from page cache. Render caching being generally less valuable for many sites than page cache, and so if you've got a site that needs to perhaps make better use and tailor its use of Redis, as in our case, it'll be easier to do that. And I can talk about that more if anybody's got questions, but definitely an issue there. One thing we saw was a lot of deadlocking on our database tables, even using Slushy Cache, because there were just so many requests coming in trying to cache things in the database. And database caches can only scale so well. Redis is a lot faster. So switching to Redis also just helped us on a performance front, aside from the cache size. So with that, I'm going to hand things back over to Kurt.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so summing up, the goals that we set out to achieve, we feel like we really helped Fairfax County get this centralized, standardized but flexible ecosystem of a lot of websites in a much more manageable state. But at the same time, they were able to make big strides in how their brand was perceived online, and how their actual content administrators are working with it, and at the same time making the code level so much easier to control to meet those goals. Yeah, it's Drupal 8. Well, this was one of our first and largest Drupal 8 deployments, and we're pleased with where we ended up. And working with Pantheon on their platform was a big part of what's made it a success to be. With that, we'd love to take your questions and hope that you've got some good ones for us.
Alrighty, thank you guys. Jumping in here, our first question is, it's a little long, so bear with me here. It says, so we started down the custom upstream path a few months ago, but then we're bummed that we wouldn't be able to manage things with Composer, so then we ended up not going with the custom upstream. Have you found a way around that, or was my information incorrect, or are you just doing it without leveraging Composer very much?
Yeah, this is Aaron. I can speak to that. Right now, it's true we're not leveraging Composer very much. You're right that pushing things down from Composer can cause some messy merge conflicts. One thing I would encourage you to do, and I'm not sure, in your case, how you're doing it. We've got a build process, so ideally, you would not commit a vendor directory very far up your upstream path, and you would only commit that right at the site level when you are ready to deploy. that makes managing any kind of merge conflicts a lot easier, because you can just make changes to your composer.json file in your upstream, and those are pretty easy things to manage, usually downstream to some degree. Now, it obviously depends if you've got fundamental incompatibilities between your requirements that you're putting in your composer.json, then there's other issues going on there. But if you can, my advice would be to you to, if you can, only build out your vendor directory at the site level, so that you're not trying to trickle those changes down via upstreams.
All right, these next couple of questions, Aaron, were during your slide. So the first one is, do you push alerts to mobile devices?
So we're only dealing with a web platform here. We don't have any sort of native app component to this. So no, we're not doing notifications on your mobile devices. You'd have to visit the website to see the alert. Now, the alert is displayed. It is styled responsively so that it displays nice on mobile devices, but folks aren't getting a ding in their pocket when an alert goes out, no.
All right. Next question. Please elaborate on the shared content feature. What's used under the hood, and how is the content synchronized?
Sure. So the content we're sharing, we're not sharing all content. We're sharing events, blogs, news, users, and user accounts. They're not all shared, but for the user and user accounts, we've got SCPS has got an Active Directory system, and they actually export the users with some associated metadata for each of those users to a formatted text file that each of our sites downloads and ingests and processes to create user accounts, and then also to create staff nodes on the individual school sites in order to create a staff directory on each school site. We use feeds for the importing of the content. So feeds would be importing the blogs, events, and news. For the user stuff, we are using the migrate module with a migrate job that runs on cron to process that exported file that I mentioned. And I should say one other small detail: we're exposing the so feeds on the school sites is consuming an RSS feed that is published from the central site. We used the views module to generate RSS, the required RSS feeds to generate those blogs, events, and news.
All right, this next one is a two-parter, and Aaron, again, this was at you. It says, you say pick one, CMI or features, but features in D8 is just bundling up configs. Why do you need to pick one? What doesn't play nice together? Just that you have multiple places where configs need to be looked for or maintained or ...
Yeah, no, you're right that features is just bundling up configuration. I guess I would want to know how you're planning on using them together, but if, let's just say you were to deploy code and run configuration import followed by a features revert, you could do that, but then your configuration that got imported would potentially get changed by the features revert. And if you ran it in the other way, it could happen the other way around. And so I would just question the goals of that, and then keeping the configuration in sync between those two exports could be a challenge. So I don't think that in my mind I can see a reason to keep them alongside each other. And I know that we had some projects early on where we did have folks try to use them together, and I want to say that we ran into some actual errors and other issues, but I can't give you good enough examples there. So I'm not sure about that, but I would say that I just don't think I understand the use case for trying to use them together.
And actually, she just responded to you and said, feeds. I thought feeds wasn't ready for D8. What is this? I'm both excited and confused.
I'll have to look and see what patches and band-aids we may have put on, but we're definitely using it.
All right. Thank you for exciting our audience. Moving on to the next one. Do/can you feed content from downstream sites to central sites, i.e. school news events, items to district websites?
We do not do that. There's no technical reason why you couldn't. I mean, it's not like there's a out-of-the-box way to do that, but if that was a requirement, we could certainly architect a way to solve that problem. We've not been asked to solve that problem, so yeah, I think the solution would vary greatly dependent upon your specific use case.
All right, next one is, can you provide ballpark ideas on length of time to set up original install profiles, spin up of bundled sites, and time to customize and add content to launch individual sites?
So I'll say that the work we did to create an install profile took longer when we did it than it would take now. So when we did this now over a year ago, the install profile situation, especially installing configuration from an install profile, was not mature in D8. And it's still not, arguably not mature, but it was a lot less mature back then. And so we had to do quite a bit of our own discovery, hacking around, custom work to get it to work at all. I will say that there is currently a patch for Drupal core that allows you to import configuration from an install profile during the install while the profile is installing without any additional modules needed. So that is been really valuable, and if you've got that patch in place, if you're just wanting to import purely configuration, it's actually really trivial. You could create an install profile that just, it's just a directory with like a .info.yaml file that just says, hey, I'm an install profile. You'd export your site configuration as a whole, stick it in a folder in that install profile. There's a couple of little settings you got to tweak to point Drupal at that location as its source of config, but when you install that, you bam, get your site configuration just that easily. So now the install profile would be pretty easy to do. You also asked about the spinning up of the new sites. That is also pretty fast. We've got a script now that does it. You saw you could do it through the UI or our script that does it. I mean, it takes on the order of minutes, so it's not a real big deal. I think I may have missed the last couple components of that question, Atusa.
It is not a problem. I think we'll move on to the next one. I think they have a sufficient answer there.
Okay.
Our next one is, do you use Slushy and Redis or just Redis?
We now use just Redis. We, for a while, used Slushy, but now that we switched to Redis, we just use Redis.
All right. Next one is, does the upstream model allow for deeper hierarchy, i.e., if a Snowflake site wanted a sub-site that made use of its extra customizations, or only a single custom base from the Pantheon upstream?
I can take that, or Ben, but you can create custom upstreams off of any repo, so you would be able to nest them if you wanted to. An upstream, there's really nothing magical about an upstream. It's just a repository that you've specified is an upstream. And the nature of the upstream model, I know I was a little bit confused by this initially because the upstream language is something very specific to Pantheon. Really all an upstream is, as I said, a repo, and it just gives the Pantheon platform some extra hooks into your repo so that the platform is looking at your repo, looking to see if there's updates, comparing the status of that repo with your downstream repo, and giving you tools to automatically merge changes from that upstream into your downstream. So really, if you are familiar with Git, if you run git merge and you specify some branch on another repo and you are merging in that branch, that's all that is happening when an upstream is being merged into your downstream. It's just a simple git merge. So yeah, you can sort of arbitrarily nest those things if you want to.
All right, next question is, in terms of UX for content management, was there any pushback from staff users who didn't want change? Was there testing, prototypes, client involvement, etc.?
This is Kurt. I can take that one. There was a lot of engagement early on with a large number of stakeholders. So the short answer is yes, there was reluctance to change, but yes, there was also a lot of appetite for standardization. So we had to kind of navigate those two things. I would say that the first 3 months of the project with FCPS was engaging with this working group that we had created that was representative of the different school types: elementary school representatives, middle school representatives, high school representatives, and the central school system representatives from like their administrative offices. We did audience persona development based upon surveys. We relied some on the branding work that had just been completed, but we also did our own interviews. We did pretty exhaustive content audits of the sampled school sites across the ecosystem, as well as the existing central school site. And then we did a lot of iteration around content modeling and information architecture, you know, kind of user pathways in order to land where we did. And I don't think we mentioned this, but one of the big goals that the central communication office had was that lots of parents have kids in more than one school, right? And they might have a middle schooler and a high schooler and an elementary school, and they really wanted to unify at least the top level terminology and navigation that they were using across the school system, while giving schools the ability to add their own kind of subsections or new sections. So we worked really hard to anchor that information architecture across the school system to be as broadly applicable and meaningful as we could. I think that we landed in a pretty good spot. I do know, though, like any change like this, particularly on the central site, which was really used heavily by administration, policy folks, principals that had been in existence for, you know, a decade, largely kind of like an internal intranet almost, that was the hardest place that we had, and the changes to kind of the day-to-day use of the content was we had to pay really special attention there. And you know, people who rely on the site every day kind of for their work, when the file that they wanted to get to wasn't in the same path it was before, it's always disjointing. But those are the steps that we took to mitigate it.
Right. Sort of on the same project management note, how long did it actually take to complete the entire project?
Kurt, again, I can speak to it high level, and we're still in the process of, as you saw from, there's 134 of the sites that are now on the platform, so we're still not done. From the start of the project until the launch of the central site, so we staged it such that we worked first on the central site as a relaunch of their brand, and that took about 9 months from start to finish for the central site. Towards the end of the central site build process, we started working on the school install profiles in earnest. So we started the project in 2015 with the goal of launching the central site before the start of the school year in 2017. And we had the install profiles ready to deploy for individual schools by the early fall of the 2016 school year. And we've taken each, like, kind of these clusters of schools through a deployment process where we first stand up their sites as vanilla sites. Then we work with the content administrative leads for each school to train them on the platform. And we work with them to migrate content from their existing site into the new site as we're teaching them how to use the system. So each kind of bundle of school site, each site kind of like determines its own readiness to pull the trigger to actually go live. But our kind of training and rollout per bundle of schools is a handful of weeks. So yeah, we've been working on the project since you know, late 2015, and we're still working on it now.
Righty. Next question. What is the architecture again? Is it one upstream per distribution, or do you have multiple distributions available in a single code base in a single upstream?
So I'm not sure if we've got a shared definition of the word distribution, but I'll try to define them and then answer the question. So we have got a single upstream for all of our school sites. Each school site has its own repository, and it has that central install profile repo specified as its upstream. So there's nothing sort of below the school site level. There's not 3 layers here. There's just a central upstream, or the common school profile upstream, and then the school sites themselves.
Alrighty, next one is when do you need to add a contrib module to only one site, and when do you just add it to the site or add it to the upstream?
So far we have not had the need to do that, believe it or not. I think that the schools have been satisfied with the feature set that we've delivered them so far, and the focus has really been on investing in this common feature set. I assume that as they continue to live with these sites for a bit and maybe experience more unique needs and pain points, that they may have more of those questions and things we maybe need to build on a more per site basis, and we'll have to make those trade-offs at that point, but we honestly haven't encountered that yet. If we do encounter that, it'll obviously be a judgment call whether or not building a particular feature makes sense for all the sites, or if there's a reason that a given site would especially not want the feature in existence on that site, in which case maybe we would need to just add it to an individual school site. We do want to avoid too much differentiation at the school site level. I mean, it's nice to have the flexibility to do so, but obviously just for maintenance costs, it's best to keep them as similar as possible. So that would be any sort of differentiation. We would want to really consider that really hard and make sure that it's justified.
Right. Next question is: in order to update the 195 sites, you push to the upstream and then need to manually process the updates to all 195 sites via Pantheon's dashboard. Is that correct?
That's close to right. We could do it via Pantheon's dashboard, but as you can imagine, that is a little bit time-consuming. So that's where we use Terminus, and as I mentioned, really anything you can do via the dashboard, you can do at the command line via Terminus. So that's where we've got a script that calls out to Pantheon, says, give me a list of all the sites. We get our, in this case, list of 135 sites back, and then we just loop through those at the command line, and this is all done via our script automatically, and it dispatches calls to each of the school sites to say merge in the upstream updates. So we're able to do that with a single command at the command line, run our script, and then all that stuff gets fired off, and those changes are all brought in. And the script does a few other things in terms of pushing those changes from the dev Pantheon environment to the test Pantheon environment, and so on and so forth. So yeah, not quite as labor intensive as maybe that would sound if you had to do it through the dashboard.
On that same note, and maybe potentially a little repetitive, the next question is: what does the update process look like when using an upstream model, and what is the degree of automation, and what are the risks/limitations?
So the update process, I mean, really, you've got to, for each individual site, you've got to either click through the dashboard or use Terminus to say merge in the changes from the upstream. If you've got unique changes in your downstream that potentially conflict with your upstream, then you might have an issue there where you're having to resolve conflicts. As I said, we don't have that sort of differentiation yet, so we've not run into that. If we do, then that's going to be obviously an added maintenance cost that we'll have to deal with. But so you'll merge in your upstream changes, and then to actually get them to production, once you've merged in your upstream changes, you're only on the dev site, so then you're going to push those changes to test, and then you're going to push those changes to production, and all along the way, you'll want to run the standard Drupal commands of importing your configuration changes or reverting features if that's appropriate, and running the update DB script so that Drupal can run its update hooks. So it looks very much standard in terms of a Drupal deployment, and the only thing that the upstream adds is that initial sort of import changes from upstream step, which, as I said, can be done via the UI or via Terminus.
All right, next question is: do features ever get shared across sites? If so, is that a manual process? How much value are features delivering if they are shared?
So I mentioned, unfortunately, we're not using features on the school sites. We are using configuration management only. And as I mentioned, this has caused a few headaches, but right now, truly, 99% of the configuration on all the sites is in lockstep with one another. The only real differentiation is school names, logo, colors, those things you saw in that one form. So we're not right now, sharing features or not sharing features. It's not something that we're considering. Now, if we needed to, we could. We probably would put them all in the code base and let you enable them on a per site basis. But we'd want to make that judgment call based upon what the specific needs were for differentiation. We might not want to share it across all. We might not want to put it in the upstream. We might want to put it in the individual code base for the site. There's a lot of sort of hairy, things around this decision, so I don't want to give you like a global recommendation. It would really depend on a case-by-case basis. You'd want to get maybe a little more on-the-ground experience with features and content configuration management to be able to make that call.
All right, I'm going to have to cut it short and just ask one more question, and that is, if we are able to know, how many people actually worked on this project?
This is Kurt. From the client side, they had a core team of really 3 folks, one close to full-time dedicated, but they were representing their communications and community affairs unit and the IT unit. The communications was kind of the executive sponsor and owner of the project in this particular case. Obviously, we worked with a number of folks at the school level we mentioned. That working group I mentioned was about 15 folks, representative from the different schools. We worked through the planning process. On our side, when it was all said and done, I would guess there were maybe 10 to 12 people that touched the project. But again, we had a core team of a technical lead. Aaron played that role for most of the project's life. We had a project manager, a user experience lead, and a creative lead. So those are really our core team. But obviously, I think we probably had a number of other folks contributing at different times. So we probably had 4 developers, Aaron, I would guess, at the peak of the kind of production process.
Yeah, that's probably about right.
Yeah, a combination of front end and back end, front end developers and back end developers. And we had some folks added to the team for QA when we were at kind of peak QA and hardening period of the project. But yeah, probably I would say close to 10 to 12 is pretty likely of how many people actually spent time on the project from Forum 1 side.
All right, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. Thank you all so much for watching. If you have any questions or feedback, please visit our website where you'll find a contact us page and we'll put you in touch with the best member of our team. Have a great weekend, everyone.